Get out of here. Get out of here.
Get the fuck out.
Get out of here. Get out of here.
At 65 years old, legendary boxing trainer Freddie Roach finally sits down to reveal the 7 fighters he hated the most, not as human beings, but as opponents. In boxing, the word hate doesn't necessarily refer to personal animosity.
The strategy and techniques, so we understand each other. I mean, we have a coordination.
Sometimes it describes the pressure, the stress, and the strategic nightmares certain fighters create. These men forced Freddie to lose sleep, rethink his entire game, and confront the brutal truth that some opponents push trainers to the absolute limit. Roach explains that the hardest part of being a trainer isn't fight night. It's everything leading up to it. The anxiety-filled film sessions, the sleepless nights watching the same 5-second clip over and over, the question that never leaves your mind. What if we're not ready?
My first champion, Virgil Hill, he was a great guy, and I think I learned a lot from him. But the guy I learned the most, the Eddie Fudge, my trainer.
The 7 names on this list, according to Roach, are the men who caused him the most mental turmoil. Each one brought something so dangerous, so unpredictable, or so technically problematic that Freddie learned to dread preparing for them. And now, we step into Roach's world, starting with a fighter whose chaotic style made even veteran trainers reconsider their sanity. 7. Ricardo Mayorga. Freddie Roach begins his list with Ricardo Mayorga, a fighter he describes as pure chaos in gloves.
Another good left hook by Mosley, off a right by most everybody. Shane's dad has asked him to focus more on body.
Mayorga wasn't a boxer in the traditional sense. He was a street brawler with a championship belt, a man who broke every rule of technical form yet somehow made it work. Roach admits that preparing for a fighter like Mayorga was a nightmare because nothing he did could be predicted. One fight he would throw wild looping punches, the next he would stand still and wait. Tape study was practically worthless. Every round of Mayorga's career looked like it came from a different fighter. Roach remembers the dread that settled in during training camp whenever a Mayorga fight was approaching. How do you prepare for someone who refuses to follow patterns? How do you develop a game plan for someone who thrives in chaos? Sparring partners couldn't imitate him. Not a single one could mimic that bizarre cadence. Mayorga also brought heavy psychological warfare, taunting opponents with vulgar insults, smoking between sessions, and entering fights with absolute fearlessness. Roach hated that unpredictability. With Mayorga, the danger wasn't simply physical, it was mental. You couldn't relax, not even for a second. 6. Antonio Margarito. The next name Freddie reveals is Antonio Margarito, a fighter whose relentless pressure and iron chin made him one of the most exhausting men to prepare for. Roach makes it clear, he didn't hate Margarito personally. What he hated was the stress his style created. Margarito kept walking forward no matter how hard you hit him. He turned clean punches into fuel, absorbing shots that would stop ordinary fighters and returning fire with brutal, grinding aggression. Roach recalls the fear that even a perfect strategy might not be enough. Training camp for Margarito was more like preparing for survival. It wasn't about winning rounds. It was about making sure your fighter didn't take too much damage. And then came the controversy, the hand wrap scandal. Roach remembers the tension, the shouting, the suspicion that Margarito was willing to cross lines others wouldn't dare approach. That combination, relentless pressure, granite durability, and unsettling controversy, made him one of the fighters Roach dreaded the most. 5. Erik Morales. When Freddie mentions Erik Morales, his tone changes, not angry, but deeply respectful. Roach didn't hate Morales as a human being. He hated the fact that Morales was a nightmare for every trainer. Morales represented everything great and terrifying about boxing: skill, intelligence, timing, toughness, and heart. Every fight with Morales felt like preparing for a general going to war. Roach describes Morales as a fighter with zero mental weaknesses. You couldn't discourage him. You couldn't break his rhythm. You couldn't make him doubt himself. Even when Pacquiao had every physical advantage, Morales found ways to make each fight painfully competitive. Roach remembers watching hours of tape only to find almost nothing to exploit. Morales adjusted mid-fight, adapted to styles, and found openings that didn't exist moments before. Preparing for him took more out of Freddie emotionally than almost any other fighter. He wasn't just tough, he was brilliant. 4. Juan Manuel Marquez Roach then turns to a name that haunted him for years. Juan Manuel Marquez. The greatest counterpuncher of the last 25 years, Roach calls him. Marquez wasn't just a fighter, he was a mathematician in gloves. Every movement was calculated. Every opening was a trap. Roach hated facing him because one small mistake could flip the entire fight. Marquez punished errors immediately and decisively. Training for Marquez demanded surgical precision. Roach often found himself revising strategies mid-round, constantly adapting to Marquez's adjustments. Pacquiao's speed and power were incredible, but Marquez had the timing to neutralize both. Roach says facing Marquez felt like walking through a minefield. One wrong step and everything could explode. The stress was incomparable. Even when they won, Roach left the arena feeling drained, knowing that Marquez had forced him to think harder than almost any fighter had before. 3. Floyd Mayweather Jr. The next name needs no introduction. Roach states clearly that his hate for Mayweather had nothing to do with personal rivalry. It was the frustration of preparing for a man who fought like smoke, impossible to grab, impossible to hit clean, impossible to trap. Mayweather wasn't just elusive, he was psychologically suffocating. He dictated pace, distance, energy, and even emotion. Freddie explains the nightmare. You can't make him uncomfortable. You can't force him into mistakes. You can't drag him into a fight he doesn't want. Every training camp preparing for Mayweather felt like preparing for a genius puzzle with missing pieces. Mayweather's defense was airtight. His counters were crisp. His footwork was misleading. His ring IQ was off the charts. Roach hated the helplessness Mayweather brought out in opponents. You could build the perfect plan, execute it beautifully, and still end up losing rounds. That, Roach says, is a special kind of torture. 2. Prince Naseem Hamed. Next, Roach discusses Naseem Hamed, a fighter so unorthodox that even elite trainers struggled to understand him. Prince Naseem didn't follow boxing rules. He bent them, twisted them, and occasionally ignored them completely. Roach hated preparing for him because Hamed's punches came from angles physics teachers might struggle to explain. He moved awkwardly but effectively, creating bizarre rhythms that confused opponents. The biggest problem? Sparring partners couldn't replicate him. No one could. That meant Freddie's fighters entered the ring with incomplete preparation, facing a style they had never seen before in real time. Hamed also carried explosive one-punch power that could end a fight instantly. His swagger, taunting, confidence, and unpredictability combined into one massive headache for any trainer. Roach admits Hamed was one of the few fighters who turned training camp into a guessing game. 1. Kostya Tszyu. Finally, Freddie ends his list with Kostya Tszyu, the fighter he hated preparing for more than anyone else. Unlike the wild styles of Mayorga or Hamed, Tszyu was terrifying because he was quiet, efficient, and brutally precise. Tszyu didn't waste punches. He didn't waste footwork. He didn't waste energy. Every shot he threw had knockout power. Every move had purpose. Roach describes Tszyu as a man who fought with the patience of a hunter and the sudden explosiveness of a trap snapping shut. Against Tszyu, the margin for error was almost zero. One mistimed jab, one misjudged step, and the fight could be over instantly. Roach hated that feeling, the sense that disaster was always seconds away. Preparing for Tszyu demanded discipline, calmness, and absolute focus. He was the kind of fighter who made even legendary trainers nervous. As Freddie finishes revealing his list, he explains that none of this stems from hatred of the men themselves. What he hated was the stress, the unpredictability, and the tactical nightmares each one created. These 7 fighters pushed him to refine his craft, forced him to evolve, and shape the legacy he carries today. In boxing, Roach explains, the fighters who scare you the most are often the fighters who elevate you. They become the measuring sticks of your career. And in finally sharing this list, Freddie allows fans to see boxing not just from the fighter's perspective, but from the mind of a trainer who lived through some of the sport's most intense challenges.